All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending tonight and joining us on this little talk about behavior-driven development. I'm Brian Sjoberg, and we already did the introduction, but I guess for the recording, I'm a Agile/Lean coach with a little technical coaching from time to time, and even the last couple of clients I've been on have done some amount of technical coaching where it's either going through some coding katas or maybe even helping out with their CI/CD pipeline. Sort of got more experience in Java and using Cucumber for behavior-driven development, but even the last two clients ago, we were doing Python. So I was like, I'll try out Behave and see what that's like. And so we ended up using that to define some of our high-level what were you doing? We were doing fraud detection and categorization of different documents that they had. And so we had some data sets that we could use and had some high level, we should get this amount of documents categorized over here and this amount here. And we had behavior tests that could run on our pipeline that would just make sure that, yep, we were still getting 80 over here and 20 over here, even as we sort of kept evolving what different categorization the machine learning techniques I think we used or something like that. But that was a couple of years ago. Not to digress anymore, but definitely be interested in talking to others after the fact. But so I wanted to talk to you all about behavior-driven development tonight, and more specifically in using it with Python. And so I've got a worked example where it's using Django. We'll bring up the local host and run it, run the behavior tests, even change the behavior tests, show it running in a CI/CD pipeline. I've got just Circle CI configured to do that stuff. But before we get into that, just for those that aren't familiar with it or want to make sure we level set, what the heck do we mean by behavior-driven development? I'm going to go into that, explain some of the benefits I've definitely seen when using BDD, go through the flow of BDD, give you an example. I'll probably skip over a little bit of this because we're going to go straight into just showing the code, starting with the feature file and the first example and this glue code that makes that all happen. So I'll probably, in the interest of time, sort of shorten that, but it'll be available, and I can certainly share these slides to whoever's interested and would like to be able to look at them in more detail, go over some of the anti-patterns that I've definitely experienced when I first started doing this stuff. The example files and if you've done Gherkin and the given when thens were very long and exhaustive and not useful, very brittle. And so I've experienced at least many of those anti-patterns that I'm going to highlight here, and then give you some of the counter to that to make sure you don't kind of repeat the same mistakes I've made in my sort of BDD career. All right, so let's get into what is BDD. So for those that do test-driven development, we'll distinguish the two as different. TDD is done to me at unit level testing. So that same red-green refactor where I write a failing test, I make the smallest amount of code to make that test pass. And then I look to potentially refactor that. If it's my first time through that cycle, then probably not going to refactor, but then I'm going to write another test that will fail, write a little bit of code. And so that's the cycle. And then occasionally think up to myself, should I refactor the code at this time? Go ahead and refactor, make sure all your tests run, then move on to another batch of tests. And so you're doing the same thing, only at a much higher level in behavior-driven development. So I'm describing user level behaviors through examples is what I typically use. Specification by Example is a great book, and what I typically use to just say, how is the user going to use this system? And they describe what actions they're trying to take, and we write those down as examples of how the system's going to be used. And so to go, as purist as possible, you could go and write your first example. It should be failing. You write the minimum amount of, I'll show you what the glue code looks like as you intend for the actual system to look. So you're actually writing, kind of the methods that you expect will be part of your product or your application before they're even written. And so then you'll run that test. It'll fail. And the good thing about making sure it fails first is that you know for a fact that the test actually failed. If I go after the fact and write tests, and I may get all of them to pass, you never know whether or not that test actually failed. So that is one of the major benefits to me is making sure that your test actually failed at some point in time. And if I write the test first, I know for a fact that it fails. And it probably fails for the reasons why I expect it to fail. So anyway, you'll hear sort of synonyms to BDD, acceptance test-driven development. Some people even refer to the functional tests. When we get down to integration level tests, that's where it definitely makes a distinction. Integration is just like two classes working together to me, or maybe a persistence layer and your business logic layer, something interacting, and not sort of that full end-to-end user level behavior. And so that's what, when I say BDD, that's what I'm referring to. So just to go over some of the benefits, you certainly get a shared understanding through examples, because I'm able to talk about the product at its user level behavior. That's in plain language. If even I'm a technical person and I'm sitting at the table with the business, and maybe even a quality engineer or something like that, we're all having a conversation about some plain language type visual representation of the system. And so through those examples, I can empathize. I know what the users are supposed to be able to do with our product. Another huge benefit of that is that it's living documentation. So as these examples are running in your CI/CD pipeline and being, every time I do a pull request, a nightly build, all of those examples, if they're passing and we're still running them, then that is the way the system is supposed to behave to the users, like through those examples. And so I constantly have, the most up-to-date way this system is supposed to behave through those written examples. I get very fast feedback. So if at the very least you're running nightly builds and you make a commit that kind of screws up some old behavior that you definitely still want the system to be able to provide, you're going to get very quick feedback, because it might take a couple hours to run the full suite, but at least it's only a few hours. And then very quickly where the problem is, because it was just the last known commit that you made that caused that failure. So very fast feedback. To me, it gives me a much higher degree of confidence that I'm not walking on eggshells when I start to try to change some code and go, God, I hope that works. It gives that safety net. And I'm confident in even refactoring and making major, significant refactors of the code, because I know I can do all that. And then if it doesn't work, run the tests. If they fail, revert back to the way it was, and maybe start over again on that refactoring. To me, it helps build the right thing right. So the built right is more in the TDD unit test level. Building the right thing is like through those examples, I'm able to describe the user's behaviors and document those, and even get to the point where, because we've talked about the examples, we're able to even provide the user, to me, a more usable product right from the get-go. And even if we don't get it right, then we change what the examples are based on that new understanding that we've gained by giving it to the user to give us that feedback. And then we iterate on it again through maybe some Scrum and sprinting on things. And then you give them another version of it a couple of weeks later. Hopefully you've tweaked all of your examples that made sense to tweak and added some new examples based on that new understanding of what the system is supposed to do for the users. So that's, to me, the major benefits you get from BDD. And BDD, even if you don't automate, at the very least, one of the biggest benefits is just having that conversation about what are the examples of how this is supposed to be used. And you have those as tests to be able to manually inspect if you don't go the full automation route, but at least you're doing that conversation way early on and not after the fact. So this just kind of walks through. Any questions so far? Feel free to interrupt me, raise your hand. Hopefully I'll notice. If Aru or Vic, you can stop me if I don't notice.
Sure thing.
But yeah, I'm very comfortable. Just stop me and we can pause, and we'll allow some digression, but certainly in the interest of everybody, we may not be able to go too far down any given path. So feedback cycles, this is just showing you, if we waited till the very, releasing at every 3 months to find out from the users whether or not this is what they wanted. That has a lot of risk associated with it. And so we're trying to squish that time down as short as possible and help lower our risk. So where we're operating in the DDD and BDD, we're talking about in the hours of time that's happening typically. And then as we move forward, but this is where it's really expensive to change things. And so the more we can find out what the users really want through even just describing examples and writing just the right amount of code to make those examples pass before we even feature proof it or overcomplicate things by adding lots of things that the users may or may not really need. We're keeping our risk as minimized as much as possible. And those feedback cycles are very quick. So before we go into a little bit more of like what the structure looks like, I wanted to just go ahead and show you what it looks like in the wild, if you will. And so I've got a first, when I typically, let me know if this is hard to see or everybody, increase the font size. So does that look good? Okay. So what I typically do when I'm just first setting up my development environment is I'll typically do a hello world just from if I don't even have making sure a Python environment is set up. I have this simple hello world here, which I just create a class and then it's going to respond back with a hi message, but it's all done at the command line. The next round I go towards, if I'm doing something with Django, is I'll actually say, if the web server is running, when I go to this URL, then I expect that URL to have a hello world in it. And so when the first time I run this, let me kill the server. So when I go to localhost, the server's not running, so it's not even going to work, right? And so I've got to make sure that I at least start the server. That now when I go to localhost 8000, I see the bank that I've created. That we'll get to that in a second. But what I wanted to show here before we even dive into that is kind of my quick way, making sure I've got everything set up. I've got Selenium running to actually run the browser and be able to find the elements that I need to find and be able to do the testing of the UI level. And so when you run behave, it's going to find the features folder that you create, and every single feature file that it finds, it's going to go through and scan at the scenario level, and then each of these given when then statements. Anytime it doesn't find any one of those given when then statements, it'll stub out some sample code for you to just drop into a step definition file. And that's what I would typically do. I'd write these statements, I run behave, and then it's going to say, hey, I didn't find this. I have a hello world application. I didn't find this when I say hi. And it'll give you some code that has some raised exceptions or something. So you'll need to actually put what's called the glue code into this. And so how behave works, it finds one of these given statements. It then goes to the step definition files that you create for it with that method signature. And these are just decorators. I think you'd refer to it. Is that Python's? I know in Java, that's what I'd call this, but decorator, right?
Yep.
And so I would actually assert hello world is not none. And when I run this test the first time and don't have a hello world class, then that's not going to pass. And so then I write the simplest hello world class. I run this again, and sure enough, it passes that step, and then it moves on to the when step, and now it's not able to pass this because I don't even have the say hi method in the hello world. So then I add that, and then I still have it not saying hello world, and then I get to this point where I run I expect it to hear hello world, and then it'll pass only once I put, let's see, where did I hide that file? Here. So once it passes back hello world, then it works. But that's just done at the just Python level and not even getting the UI, the browser into play. So that next feature file or the next example is actually making sure I've got Django set up. I can start up the server, and then I wire up enough of the URL mapping that says that when this URL is found, I expect, or I'm going to show this HTML page. And so that's what you'll see when I actually go to, I'm going to lower this just a little bit so I can show you the URL. I can't see it. 8,000 hello world. So that's my simple program that I wrote that will make this pass. And I won't go into the details of Django, but just know that that's what's going to happen in our first, when I type in behave, it's going to run through this. And so I'll do that real quick in another browser. So I type in behave. So now it's popping up. Selenium's now putting up a Chrome browser. It's going to run through that hello world test. And now it's going to run through, or it already did. It ran through the sign up feature, which is the online bank account. So I've just created this example sort of application that's an online bank, and that the first example that we're going to just get working is that a user can sign up for the bank account, say they want checking, and then if it's, they're approved or it gets created, we notify them that it was created. And so when we first walk through this feature, this example, then it's not going to pass because we don't have an online bank. And what we're simply saying is that when we go to the bank, I'm trying not to type on my one. Here's that first given step. I'm going to minimize these. Oops. So what I would do is that given step, I'm going to go to an online, bank account. That doesn't work right now. But what I typically will do is actually write in the code. This is the step definition code of, like, I need to create a browser. I'm going to go to this URL. That's the one that Django has set up and running. I'm going to just look at what the title of that is. Initially, it's going to be like Django setup. So this test won't pass until I actually create the HTML that will now show online bank in the title of the actual browser. So when I actually go to localhost 8,000, once I've put in the minimal amount of code, then I'm going to now see online bank, and this will pass this given step. And I don't always put like asserts in givens and wins. Typically, then is where you're expecting an outcome and you can assert that outcome. But it doesn't hurt. Like when I'm first getting this up, or let's say the server's not running or something happened, if I only have it in the then step, I have to dig a little bit deeper to potentially find out that, oh, it's the server's down. So to me, I like having asserts even in some of the other steps that aren't just the then steps. So even this one, when the user clicks that sign up button, so here they're now going to the sign up page and they would enter in their information and then click submit. I'd also assert here, did it actually go to the sign up page? So it's now checking that it's not on the online bank, and now we're on the sign up page. And I didn't put any of the code that you would typically see in here so that Selenium would sit there and fill in all this information for us and then hit the submit button. You could expect to see that like right in here. The one thing that you might be curious about is I've got two statements, two decorators for this one step definition. That allows you to have different the a versus and. Like if my expected status starts with a consonant versus a vowel, I want to have it to be towards still human readable. It doesn't kind of trip me up. Typically in Cucumber, I just have to put a pipe, I think here, like this. And I don't need an extra statement, but that's just the way I got it. It seems to work with behave. Any questions so far? Thoughts?
Brian, so you said you put the asserts in the given when then, and that like helps you debug, like I guess if the given step fails or like which step fails. So what happens if you don't do that? Like, is it just harder or?
Yeah, to me, if I only have it at the expected, here I'm testing whether or not it said approved. I mean, you're still going to get, when you try to make that connection here, you're going to get a failure. in the example that I'm giving as far as the server. So it may not be the best of examples, but it's just not, to me, a bad idea. It's not horrible to have asserts in something other than thens, because in my experience, it's definitely helped me like isolate where the issue is more quickly than me sort of poking around and then only to find out 20 minutes later that when I ping the test server that it's down. I was like, oh, well, that would have been nice to know. So that's just, and maybe I'm not giving the greatest example, but hopefully that makes sense as far as the value and sometimes in having asserts in other places other than the then step. So.
No, that makes sense. Thanks, Brian.
Dave is saying that you're having a hard time seeing my window. Oh, I can't see
it. Now it looks like you're probably sharing your entire monitor, so adjusting the size of a given window isn't going to do anything. But if you could bump the font up a bit, that would really help. In your, yeah.
Good.
I can barely see that.
All right, jeez.
Pardon my tired old eyes.
No, it's all right. It's definitely late. And yeah, so no, thanks for that feedback. So without sleeping this and showing the browser, and I'm sure many of you have probably either had user interface type testing like this. I'm using Selenium here. You could use Cypress. You pick up different, I know Sauce Labs is another tool that allows you to do this very quickly across many browsers. And you don't have to go and pull down the Gecko driver and the Chrome driver and have that all set up locally and then also on your test server. But this is definitely a way to get user interface type testing right out of the gate. And so day one of writing this application, I could already have a couple of examples. I can even dip down into unit level testing. And so with Django, I meant to show you this. You can test whether or not when I specify this URL, do I get the template back that I expect? And so before I put in any of this URL mapping, it's those tests are going to fail. And that to me, it's kind of unit level testing, but then also some of the stuff once you actually get into the inputs that you're expecting, like for last name, first name, did they put all like actual characters and no numbers? For if you had social security number, did they put in the right amount of numbers, that kind of stuff? There you could be writing a bunch of unit tests. And so what I wanted to also demonstrate is when, let's say we've developed this application and we initially put the words, created as what we give the users notification that, their account's been approved. And because I'm, back in the CRUD days, I think we still do CRUD, right? Create, retrieve, update, delete. That was the wording I used as a more technical person, but really it wasn't the right wording to use for our users. So we went ahead and change that to approved. And let me see. So in the, not in the sign up, but in the application status, we're going to change this to approved, right? And before we're just going to run our tests, our unit level tests, right? And let's just imagine the world where we've got tons of these behavior tests now or examples and features. And we just want to make sure we can run those quickly, the unit tests, but the example tests now take a significant amount of time. So like, just change that, shouldn't break any of our unit tests or any of our example tests. So I'm going to go ahead and commit this into our code repository, changed, created. And so we're going to push that up to the repo that I have, and I can share the repo if you are interested in looking at some of the code in more detail. And I've got, like I said, Circle CI now that's kicked off a build in our Circle CI environment, and I can show you the YAML file of all these different steps that happen. And while that's running, it's going to sit there and take about a minute or so. I can just show you quickly like what a Circle CI YAML file looks like, and for those that have done any kind of configuration like this, you probably can get an understanding pretty quickly of what's happening here. So I've got the various, run steps. Those are the different steps that are in here. Downloading Selenium, starting Selenium, run the actual unit test like I just did locally. And then I'm going to migrate any database changes. I'll start the actual server that is the online bank. And right now I've got a sleep in here of 12 seconds just because I'm still playing around with this one curl command where I can keep retrying. But anyway, I don't want to digress too much, but I need to at least make sure that the server is up so that when I start running the behave tests, that the server is available and I can, that they will pass as long as the server's up. And so, we wait a little bit of time and then we're like, oh crap, we broke the build, because we expected in the example that it should say created, but now it says application approved instead of created. And so we at least caught that quickly. Hopefully within an hour, we found out that we broke something. And so we can go back and change that. But what I would even encourage anytime that actually should occur is we change. So I will change back the application status to created, right? And then we go to our signup feature, we change it here to approved. And now we're going to run our behave tests and they should break now. And then we go and change just the amount of code that needs to happen to make that pass. And so we've got a failure, and sure enough, it's the same failure that we see on our CI/CD environment. And now we go change the application status, should say approved, right? Save it, and now we run them again. Quickly, we could remove the hello world feature if we wanted to once it's up and running, but I'll keep it there. Now we'll kick up our online bank. Did it already flash up? Yep, it did. So now we're passing. Now we can go ahead and commit our code. Let's say approved. And so that's the way, your examples will change over time. And that's what I would encourage is one, writing your examples, and I'll get into some of the details of how the examples and the way they're written here is more declarative and like what the user's trying to do, and not getting into what's, explicit imperative style statements, which are like how the user's doing the action they're trying to achieve. The how typically is going to be found in your step definitions. Like here, when I actually click on some buttons, I enter in some information. One of my failures early on was I was putting that in my example file. So given I'm going to this bank, when I do all of this stuff, fill in all of these details, then I expect this and this and this and this. The examples are just massive. And so boil it down to like what the user is trying to do in the example written statements in human readable, and then the glue code will be where you actually describe like how the user is using the system. So we should be able to check now with Circle CI and go to it, and yay, we succeeded. So here's all those steps I was showing you in the YAML file. And we can go in here, and behave allows you to, if you run behave with, I think, --JUnit, it's going to output to JUnit or XUnit XML format. So anything like Jenkins or Behave or Bamboo is going to be able to interpret that and be able to show it visually like what happened. And so if you have a failure, at least you can easily see that failure in your CI/CD environment. Thoughts on any of that?
Brian, Mariel was wondering if you could share the repo in chat.
Oh, sure. Yep. Let's see. There you go. And so I'll make, apologize, my README isn't quite where it probably needs to be, but you should be able to sort of at least get the server running with a quick migration on your side, and then be able to run the host.
Even just looking at code helps. That
gotcha.
Looking at code that works that someone else has written is generally how I learn. So.
Yep. Same here. Yeah. And especially if it's a repo that I've created in the past, and I'm like, how did I do that? Like, oh yeah, there it is. Nope. Totally get that. Okay. Yeah. I don't think there's any, I'm trying to think of what else. to show you as far as a demonstration, I can switch this real easily. I don't know, we could fire through like all the different, I only have Firefox and Chrome on here, but now I can rerun this. But I know you can also set it up to where it's going to just go through each of your different browsers. And so now you can see that, you know, Firefox is coming up, McAfee, no, so. So sure enough, we passed in Firefox and we passed in Chrome, and that was pretty easy for me.
I had a question. So obviously, you're dealing with text in a browser, which may have like inline elements that are like either like spanning elements that may affect formatting or such. Do any of these tools come with ways to strip that out, or at least test the visible or parts of the text maybe that you want to validate versus having to match against like an HTML substring? Or are you kind of beholden to pulling in external libraries that would maybe do that for you within Python?
I think what you're talking about, like in Selenium, here's where I'm actually going to find the body tag. So I'm not searching the full document, if you will. I can go specifically to a tag. I know you can go through the nested frames if you wanted to specifically. So it doesn't take you as long to traverse some of that stuff. If that is that what you're talking about? Like I can go to element by tag name. Okay. I can go to element by ID.
Yeah, not quite. But I think actually looking at this code again, the dot text seems to be what I was getting at, like getting the actual rendered text rather than the whatever elements might be within the body tag, for example. But
gotcha. Yep. Yeah. You're not getting all the align equals this and all that. That's yep. So and that's where the full body text, when you saw it fail here in you can see that this is actually what is the full body, and I just am doing a Python as long as it's in that text string, I'm asserting that that's fine. So you can see here, like I just want to find approved somewhere in the full body string somewhere. Does that make sense?
Yep. Thanks.
Yep. Thanks. Yep. So you all have the code to pick it apart and make fun of it however you want. And I will switch back to the rest of the slides. So the flow I've already kind of described, I think, in at least verbally, and I've got at least some sort of visuals that I think help as well, to where you can think about how this all maps together. So I've got a vision of the product, and I start to break that down into large, goals. At least I need to get where people can sign up and they can, manage their checking account as the minimal, or they can transfer money. That's our current goal. We need those, certain capabilities to make that happen. Here are the features that are going to make those capabilities become available. I can start breaking this down into smaller stories that I'll iterate on, either the sign up, first iteration of it, and then I might add more details or improve the sign up side of things through multiple stories. And then I've got acceptance criteria with each of those stories. It tells me like, when am I done with that story? From that acceptance criteria is where I can start start having those conversations about what's an example of how the user is going to achieve that outcome, the acceptance criteria. And then we get all the way down to the code. And so that's kind of how it all ties together. How this might look like in the wild is I've got if I'm operating in sort of a Scrum environment where I've got a backlog of prioritized items, you don't need to go and write examples for every single prioritized item in your backlog. You're going to look at the top couple of items that are going to be coming up to the team to be able to implement, and starting to have the more detailed conversations about what's the user going to try to do with this particular user story, and then start documenting those examples. And then those become a feature file for sign up. You might have a feature file for managing account or something like that. And we write a first couple of examples. Team goes off and is now hopefully it's a constant collaboration, even with the business side that's helping articulate some of those examples. But then you've got the three different perspectives, which we like to see, and maybe most of you know it when I say three amigos, is I've got a meeting of the minds where I've got that diverse perspective of someone who's out there looking out for the user's perspective, and someone technical minded like a developer, and then you've got maybe a quality engineer type tester that's also coming at it from that perspective. So when I can get those three around at a table in front of a whiteboard, usually you get a lot of really good productive conversations happening about what exactly we're trying to build here. And we can describe all of that conversation into examples. There's a really cool example mapping is, if anybody's done story mapping, kind of similar, but for writing examples. There's a good technique for that. And you could just, I think, Google search and find example mapping, and you'll find that. Then from those examples, that really helps give the team guardrails as to what exactly we're trying to build. And so let's keep them, focused on that. And then in a really cool world, you've got, those examples sort of failing right from day one of the sprint. Team goes off, starts maybe doing some TDD, small cycles until they get that first example passing, and then keep going until they've gotten all the examples green and all their unit tests green. Then they know they're done with the story. And so that would be an ideal world. Can't say I've seen that quite in the wild yet, but certainly have goals to aspire there. But I have heard that that's where some teams operate, and it's pretty damn cool when you don't have to even ask the question like, "Are we done with this thing?" It's like, "Are the lights green?" "Yep, they're green. We can ship it." So just a little Three Amigos joke here, but I'll, in the interest of time, keep moving through that. So when I'm talking about acceptance tests and stuff like this, I don't know if anybody's ever seen the metaphor of like building something that can help me get from point A to point B. I may, spend an entire couple of years and finally get to giving you a car. And in that time, I've really restricted myself in getting good feedback from you as to whether or not that's the right thing to build. And so in the metaphor and doing this in a more agile way, I give you a skateboard, that first MVP, and you can start giving me feedback. Well, I can describe at least the minimal sort of examples of what I expect you to be able to do with the skateboard and have those as running tests and look to evolve even those tests as I start to learn more information from how you're using this, what you want to do with it. And those become the suite of regression tests even that I can run all the time to make sure that I'm still fulfilling what I've told you I'm going to provide you as a usable application. And so this is just my way of sort of helping understand sort of when we're talking about acceptance tests and examples, what we mean by that. And so here I've got one that's, initially it's just getting from point A to point B in 10 minutes. And right now, until I build that MVP skateboard, I can't even pass that test. But once I build you that skateboard, I give it to you, it sure enough can pass that point A to point B test. Well, you give me some feedback and says, I really need this thing to go faster and I need to be able to stop because I'm in San Francisco and I keep running myself into stop signs and it's pretty painful. And so now we've written another example, which is to be able to stop within 10 feet when you're at 20 miles an hour. And you also want to be able to get from point A to point B much quicker in 5 minutes. So we build you a bike. We're now passing those tests and keep evolving both the examples and the product as we're learning more and more information. That's kind of the flow of what I'm trying to show you here and what I've hopefully also been describing when we were walking through some of the code. One really good technique that I know, I'll screw it up, but I think George can back me up. Gochko Ajtech wrote this book, great book on specification by example, and that is specifying the behaviors of a system through examples. And so I've already beat this, I think, pretty hard as far as like the value in it. So I won't belabor this too much more, but it's a way to describe what the user is trying to do with the system. And I don't know that Gherkin formally came after specification by example or is because of it, but not long after or right around the same time that given when then sort of structured format came out for how to write examples. Given, I'm doing the assemble part of the three A's, and then I act, which is the when, and then I assert on the then statement. And it's a formal way to do this. There are other programs, I think, and George, it was Gauge, I think, is the one that ThoughtWorks came out with, where it's a more free form. It wasn't even structured with given, when, then. Is that right, George?
That one I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, I thought it was. Wasn't it Gauge?
I don't know, but Goiko is the
Goiko, yeah.
The first name, and the last name I'm not going to pronounce correctly. It's close to Ajik.
Ajik, okay, yeah. Thank you. But there is something similar to a Cucumber, but it doesn't even restrict you to any kind of given, when, thens that most of the other tools do. I know there also, I sent to Vic, PyTest actually has a BDD extension that you can go look at the repo. It's very similar to Behave and on par with probably the same amount of downloads and star ratings, if you will, as Behave does. So it might be worth looking into. I might try to create a similar version of this in PyTest BDD. So I walked through this flow already. Here, just showing you a visual of what that looks like. Failing example, failing unit tests, write the minimal amount of code to get the unit test to pass. It passes. Keep in those cycles until you get that first example to pass. Move on to the next example. Write some unit tests. That might be a useful way that for me, breaking down problems into very small bite-sized chunks, that's the way I've enjoyed coding, and helps me keep my brain from going too crazy trying to think about all the different paths. But it may not be for everybody. And certainly the very super strict, if you will, TDD is not something that you have to live with. And even if you read anything by Kent Beck, one of the godfathers or whatever of TDD, he says, he doesn't even write code in the way, once he really understands exactly what's going to happen, he'll skip some of those steps. It's only those very small baby steps that he's doing when he's working in some area where he's not familiar with it, or doesn't know it very well, or has some uncertainty, if you will. So just wanted to say that as a caveat to TDD. And then on the example, like I said, I just want to share, since I walked through the worked example, I think we've got some code and how it goes from, I don't have a user story specified for there, but you could imagine a user story for sign up, and there's specific acceptance criteria for that user story that allows the development team to know when they're done with that particular story. So this is similar, but just a slightly different example of that. Just the users trying to make sure that they are sort of not putting in passwords that would make it to where their accounts could be hacked very easily. So here you can imagine, acceptance criteria for, creating a strong password or a very secure password. And here are some of the expectations we have to make sure that that can be a secure password. And we can go and write a couple of examples here of when we expect it to not pass, and then when we expect it to pass. And then could have a couple examples here, given, when, then, when we expect it to pass. Here's the password that we can put into this, and it should pass eventually once we have the code working. And then here's some examples of an insecure, and what do we display to the users when they put in an insecure password. Here, that error message would show, and sorry, I'm pointing to my screen, but this error message right here is what we could show different errors messages in a table lookup. This is another way that Behave and Cucumber allow you to structure the scenarios. If I've got something that I want to just keep repeating multiple times, I can put it in this table format. It's called a scenario outline. And then I can just go through this, but it basically executes an example for each one of these, but makes it very much more human readable than actually have like a separate example for each one of these different things where you're only changing the error message that comes out. And so this is what the glue code would look like for that. And what it looks like when you're in Selenium. This is probably more Java based than it is for Python, but it's similar enough. And so, yeah, I didn't want to spend a lot of time on that. I was trying to keep this to 45 minutes to an hour. So I'm go ahead and move on to anti-patterns, what to do so that you don't repeat some of the mistakes that I made. So give you a brief moment here to read this little cartoon. Many of you may have seen this. Many of you have probably experienced it, to where we just don't look at the tests, or we even comment out all those failing tests. And we'll get to it when sometime, right? So we don't want that to happen. If you sort of do some of these anti-patterns, that's typically where it starts to go down that path of like just commenting out or not even looking at those failing tests anymore. So we don't want that. We want these tests to be always valuable and really the living document that sort of describes what our system should be doing. And so this is the high level view of like what I'm going to go into on each one of these slides. So no layers of abstraction. So maybe everything lives in our glue code. Expressive tests, I talked about how you can have these given when thens that are miles long, but take multiple sheets to describe one example. Don't want to do that. We could have dependencies on other tests, where if one test fails, it was dependent on another test passing. I definitely don't want that. And then I went down the path of like creating a feature file for every single story that quickly gets out of hand. And so what we mean by the no layers of abstraction, our business rules are tightly coupled into our implementation, like the how. So it's tough to separate those things. Here's an example that's describing doing this in an expressive way or imperative statements, where I've got given exactly in sort of how we got there, going to the website, clicking through the actual user interface, and then what we expect to happen. But it's very specific, and this isn't even a great example of what you could typically see. Like if I tried to purchase something on Amazon and wrote this in imperative style, it could be lots of clickology that has to happen before I can finally click that checkout button and maybe have something shipped to my house. So we don't want to do this. Definitely, this is what it could look like. I've had examples that were like 27 to 33 steps in the past, and that's not really helpful for anybody. It's a way to kind of, when you first get introduced to this and maybe have had experience with writing old test scripts, which were maybe an Excel sheet, or maybe even use sort of a Mac or a UI record tool. It's basically recording these, and it almost seems like a natural, like, oh, well, yeah, I can just do this. I can just describe it just like I used to in this Excel file. But that is very brittle. So the second I move a button here, or I change what page it's on, I'm now like causing this to break. You're still gonna, that will break, but at least keep that in the glue code. So it's not something that you as the users that are trying, or the team that's trying to help describe your system in human readable format, don't want to be just inundated with a lot of noise, if you will, by having all those very specific things in there. Dependencies on other tests, kind of already described that. Like I don't want the situations where I need to set up the database maybe through one scenario, one example, and then if that doesn't pass, then I don't have it in the state that I need it for the next test to pass. And so this can become a nightmare as well, to where I don't know why this, I've got multiple tests now failing. For what reason, I don't know. Oh, it's because the test before that didn't actually pass. So we don't want to do that. We want to make those independent. And then I went down this path where kind of made sense, to where we just created a new feature file for every single user story that the team's creating. And that gets unwieldy, especially when you're talking about maybe 1,000 stories that might describe the build of the product. And so there's high level features that are in an application. You think of Amazon, and there's a feature of search, a feature of a shopping cart. That's what we want to keep a file of, and have examples of what we expect to be happening for those features. Yeah, George.
Are there tools or plugins to existing tools or anything that help with organizing things beyond just sort of, here's this feature file, here's that feature file, here are the directories?
Yeah, great question. I know for a fact IntelliJ has a Gherkin plugin to where when I start typing in given I want, or I did, it'll autocomplete that or show me the available ones. I didn't get that to work. I have the Gherkin plugin, so you see at least the syntax highlighting for PyCharm, but there might be a PyCharm one or maybe a VS Code one that actually does that as well. But yeah, that is hugely valuable, especially when you've got, what could be, I don't know, 100 given statements, making sure you don't just create another given statement because it's hard to find the one that might be the one you need. When you have that autocomplete, that to me is a real huge valuable thing to have, to where you don't start just creating a bunch of duplication of given whens and then step definitions. Is that what you meant?
No, but it's definitely interesting.
Oh,
sorry. I was thinking more just at the larger, well, I mean, it does one of the things that you would want to get out of a good way of organizing your things. That is, you can find the thing and don't end up duplicating the thing. But I was thinking more like it stores them in a database or something, and then you can slice and dice and recombine the files or view in different groupings.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm not sure. I only have experience with what I was describing, so sorry I misheard you. But you do find that, or if I find that, stumble onto it, I'll definitely let you know. All right, so how do we do the inverse of that? So we don't want to have those anti-patterns that they're easy to have happen. And so what we can do is definitely make sure we have the layers of abstraction. We're creating declarative statements and not imperative expressive statements. We don't have dependencies on tests. And I forgot to I've got databases too, but you can certainly make sure that your database is in a set state, so that you're initializing that every time. You're not adding test 1, test 2, test 3, test 4, test 5 to your data set, and it's causing your things to kind of drift to where you've got information in your database that you should not be continue to keep in there. And I'm not talking about your production server or anything like that, just a test database. So what do we mean by, the business rules is really where we describe in example format, given I expect the user to go to this page. When they do this, then I expect them to achieve this outcome. That's business rules. And then glue code is where that business flow is starting to happen, to where I've got the clickology happening. And then the technical layers where we're actually, connecting to our product and doing stuff underneath the hood. And so we want to make sure that we don't tightly couple all of that stuff in one file, and have got some separation that's happening there. And this is just showing you an example of what that might look like. I've got a win statement. In that win statement, it maps to here, and here's the clickology that's happening in this, and what I actually go and find that menu option, and then what's actually happening in my code. And that's what we mean by layers of abstraction, or I mean by layers of abstraction. Here's what we would like to see in most of our example files. No more than 5 statements would be probably ideal, what I would shoot for. Maybe a single given statement and a when with maybe an and then a then with an and. But the more you can keep that at a very high level, the more it's going to keep the whole audience that you really want engaged when talking about these examples and describing your system this way. No dependencies. So yes, we should have isolation. We can even run in parallel every single one of these examples on a different server for each, and they all should run without a problem and pass if everything's functioning the way we expect. Initializing the database, just making sure that we're not adding a Harry Potter book to our Amazon data set, and then we expect to see 26 results of Harry Potter get returned when we first run it, but then over time it grows to like 40. It's not a very deterministic way of it's drifting and changing over time. So we want to make sure that the database is in a position that we expect it to be in when we start the test, and then even revert anything that we may have added to the database, or just tear it down and then have another database for the other tests. That is one way to certainly do it. Because what could happen is that, if I tweak the database and something happens with the test, it doesn't destroy what was in the database that I added or delete it, then I have some drift occurring that I need to certainly manage. It may get out of hand and be troublesome at some point. And then that last thing is making sure that you understand what are your different features, and that'll evolve over time, but you want to make sure you have one feature file for that specific feature, but then examples in there. And it may become to where you could see a feature file be thousands or at least hundreds of lines long with, tens of hundreds of examples. That's where it might make sense to break this up a little bit, just to make it a little more effective or something. But yeah, you definitely don't want to have a mapping of a feature file to a story. You'll have 1,000 feature files before you know it. All right, and that's kind of BDD and doing it in Python in less than an hour, hopefully. Kind of went through like, what is BDD? It's that methodology of starting with the example first, and if you automate it, awesome, but really it's the conversation about what we expect the users to do with our particular features. And then the benefits are certainly living documentation. We've got something, we've built the right thing and we built it right. We get fast feedback when something does break. We've got a growing level, the regression tests that grow over time. It gives me a high degree of confidence to be able to just update the code and change the inner workings of the code and know that when I run all those tests and they still pass, I haven't broken anything in the product. Went through the anti-patterns, don't need to regurgitate those, and then how we can make sure we don't see those anti-patterns sort of surface in our product development. So this is some of the material that I certainly used. The test-driven development with Python is that example that I'm showing you is what they did in that book, but they did it with just using functional tests. And I took that to the level of, using behave now instead of just, I think it was PyTest or unit test, but they were just describing functional level tests with that unit test framework. But those are some great material to read. There's plenty out there, good YouTube videos even, I think, on some of the stuff, some good stuff on O'Reilly. But that is it for what I had to show you all. And appreciate your time, but certainly available for questions.
Yeah, do we have any questions for Brian? I guess we're in Q&A now.
Go ahead, Dave.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I saw Dave's hand up, but that may have been from a while ago. Who's saying something? I cut you off, sorry.
No worries, that was me. Thanks for that. Have you had much experience exposing like the Cucumber portions of this to perhaps maybe a dedicated QA team or personnel, and how to maybe integrate that in a nice way where it's not necessarily them touching a Git repository or similar? Like, are there like test runner frameworks that one can stand up that just handle all of this for you in a nice way, or?
So let me try. So if I've got a team that typically is doing this maybe manually and want to expose them to Cucumber and them to be able to create some of this stuff without having to have them write code.
Yeah, so let's say an engineering team has written the actual like scaffolding for, okay, if like I am on the login page, or there's like, so we provided the framework for like a Cucumber test plan to be executed. However, of course, the other end of that is you need to run the tests and have written tests. I was wondering if you've seen a reasonable way to have that kind of collaboration happen.
I'm thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And when I introduced this at a hotel chain, the test team yeah, I'm struggling with. Oh, let me just, what's on my mind, as far as like, we took some of the stuff that they were running as tests manually and introduced them to Cucumber. I think we still would have a developer doing the step definition type coding, but then some of the testers actually, once you saw enough of that step definition stuff in either Selenium or something like that, then they even started to update those and even add their own step definitions over time once they got comfortable with it. But yeah, they weren't necessarily in the repository. Only over time though, once the feature files, definitely you want those in the repo. They were actually adding new feature files in the repo and managing the ones that were in there already. I don't know that quite got there. The other thing I like to do is certainly coding katas, where you could do any one of the like Roman numeral or something like that, FizzBuzz, and do it in a behavior-driven development. I certainly do that at most of the clients that I've been to recently, and some testers want to be involved in that and are like eager to want to learn that stuff and know that the job that they have is not going away. It's just refocused where they can write those, but that they can actually keep up with all the regression testing that they used to do manually, but now they're able to do it through automation.
Cool, thank you.
How did your experience like doing this in Java compare with sort of doing it in Python?
I think I fought with more stuff in Java than I fought with Python. I do like Python now, and I even dabbled around with Scala for the 2 clients ago. So that was my like introduction, I think, into Python was through Scala, from a Java Scala Python. Yeah, no, it's very similar though too. Like between Behave and Cucumber, I know you can write your own sort of matchers and stuff like that, which can match to different class structures that I may have, and so you can really expand the capability of Behave or Cucumber to be even more specific to like a money class or something like that, to where I can actually pass in a $sign and it knows that's should be, I think that might be a useful enough example, but yeah, other than integer or string, you could start to expand it to match the specific classes that you might be coming up with, data structures. Yeah, I'm eager to try out PyTest BDD. Looks very,
I really like
similar.
the link you sent me. I looked at it, but I haven't. Yeah, I mean, I've used PyTest, but I've never done the Behave with PyTest. Do we have any more questions for Brian? Otherwise, I can stop the recording and we can go into happy hour, guys. Going once, going twice. All right, I'm stopping the recording.